We are quite convinced that the general public, the tech and industry leaders, as well as most scientists, feel sure that we humans actually have no efficient or of-scale way to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We claim and prove in this video and series that we humans firmly have in reach a costless, easy, and logical way for all 8 billion humans to thrive, and at the same time to remove all post-industrial carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and this in a surprisingly short period of time, certainly in less than 20 years. 13 billion hectares of productive agricultural lands. Instead of focusing on carbon dioxide in one way or the other, we prefer to focus and alert for an alarming rate of degeneration of all our productive soils, which are as much as 13 billion hectares, this when only the productive agricultural lands are considered. 13 billion hectares roughly is 2 times the size of the continental USA, or 2 times Europe, or 2 times the Amazon forest across South America. Well, until 2050, 90% of this immense and for human health, thriving and existence essential areas will have become irreversibly unproductive, and this worldwide. Surprisingly or perhaps shockingly, nobody seems to talk or to care about it, so we 8 billion or more modern humans could very well be in for a very ugly surprise, and that long before 2050, this unless we urgently wake up for this challenge, and use our immense but by most unrecognized potential, or rather that of carbon-agroforests, to transform this and other threats in thriving and solving. As an example, an unmanaged tropical forest, and also certain of the most productive planted forests, but above all the carbon-agroforests, produce roughly 30 metric tons of biomass a year, and per hectare. When expressed in carbon content, that roughly is the equivalent of the yearly production of 30 tons of carbon dioxide, like the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, including the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere emitted by the burning of fossil fuels. So if we transform only 7.6%, or less than 8% of our most degenerated or already unproductive agricultural land in carbon-agroforest, we would be transforming, and much more importantly regenerating roughly 1 billion of hectares of kind of newly productive land, this if optimally and dedicatedly done, into some of the most biodiverse forests ever known. In the case all agricultural land would be upgraded to carbon-agroforests, this newly regenerated and carbon dioxide removing area could become as much as 13 billion hectares or even more, and this in a limited number of years. But even by transforming a more modest 1 billion hectares of degenerated agricultural land into carbon-agroforests would remove roughly 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, in the case that is of our interest. Just as a reference, as of early 2024, 27 direct air capture or DAC plants were in operation worldwide, capturing the for removal insignificant amount of 1.3 million tons of carbon dioxide per year in 2023. That is much less than 0.01% of the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted yearly. Please notice that the BIOS proposed 1 billion of hectares of carbon-agroforests would remove the amount of 30 billion tons per year, which roughly is the amount of the yearly accumulation of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, which includes the emissions caused by the burning of fossil fuels worldwide, but also, the BIOS more critically considered, substantial and rapidly increasing carbon dioxide emissions caused by the degeneration of our immense area of agricultural soils. Possibly the general public is not really aware that nearly all agricultural lands are tilled by large machines at least once a year, and that tilling especially over the long term leads to a net loss of soil organic carbon which immediately is emitted into the Earth's atmosphere. In other words, even if the burning of fossil fuels would become zero, our actual agricultural practices would still lead to substantial, possibly to even higher carbon dioxide emissions, than what is actually the case. As said before, it is not the carbon dioxide emission that we see as the main challenge, but it is the immense and kind of exponential soil degeneration that we see as the main challenge. In fact, we see it as a direct and imminent challenge for human and animal existence. Besides, as explained just earlier, soil degeneration could and probably will become our main source of future still or even more massive carbon dioxide emissions. This makes that solving soil degeneration should be an absolute priority, including in order to avoid human and animal extinction. It should also, or even more, be considered a priority, because apart from its importance regarding existence, non-degenerated soils obviously are the basis of human thriving, health, quality of life as well as life expectancy. In other words, we see the action plan of transforming 1 billion hectares of degenerated and eventually already unproductive soils into carbon agroforest as kind of mandatory, That is, if we humans want to thrive and stay healthy, and we see carbon dioxide removal rather as a logic but beneficial collateral of the principal aiming, this through an action plan, for all humans to remain thriving or to thrive more, as well as to maintain or to improve our health, and, consequently also our life expectancy, as well as achieving a minimum of natural birth rates, aspects that especially rather recently became clearly challenged. Brazil's agricultural land area, including crops and pastures, is estimated to be around 250 million hectares, and it produces around 10% of all food of the world. So the Brazilian 2% of the world's agricultural land produces 10% of all food. Brazilian 2% of the world's agricultural land is less than 4% of the international Amazon forest. Just for your info, and to put things in perspective, and maybe to the surprise of many, the Brazilian part of the Amazon forest comprises roughly 420 million hectares, almost the double of Brazil's agricultural land area, that produces 10% of the world's foods, and in fact this relative modest part of Brazil could produce 10 times all food the world needs, if it were converted into carbon-agroforest. The case of only 10% of only carbon-agroforests used for food production. We will be working with a case that 7.6%, or less than 8% or 1 billion hectares of our most degenerated or already unproductive agricultural land is transformed into carbon-agroforests. If only 10% of this 8%, or only this 1 billion hectares of carbon-agroforest capacity would be used for food production, and assuming the proven fact that carbon-agroforest produces 100 times more biomass than that traditional agriculture does produce food, that would make that 1 billion hectares of carbon-agroforest would produce 400% of or 4 times all the food that 8 billion humans consume on a daily basis, this even considering the very limited use of only 10% of the 1 billion hectares of carbon-agroforest capacity. Now we reach out to an earlier calculation made in an earlier video, and further we will base on the proven fact that carbon-agroforests produce at least 50 tons of wood or for biogas production suitable biomass per year, and per hectare, compared to the about 30 metric tons of biomass for a standard tropical forest, simply because carbon-agroforests have much deeper and more fertile soils. And on top of that are managed for additional production, as well as for dedicated, or directional production. The evidence for this is presented in other videos. Carbon-agroforest natural gas versus fossil natural gas. You will notice that we refer to carbon-agroforest natural gas when it is prevenient from gasification, or a kind of cooking of biomass prevenient from carbon-agroforests, and we refer to fossil natural gas when it is prevenient from extraction from the Earth's soil. The carbon-agroforest natural gas does not contain toxic elements. This while fossil natural gas or the gas dominantly on the market contains small but certain quantities of toxics, or rather elements that can be toxic for humans and animals, or prejudice their health, simply because fossil natural gas contains toxins from the mineral layers it was extracted from. 10% of carbon-agroforests used for carbon-agroforest natural gas production. 50 tons of wood or biomass per year and per hectare will result in 18 tons of syngas or 16.2 tons of carbon-agroforest natural gas. 1 billion hectares of carbon-agroforest will result in 18 billion tons of syngas or 16.2 billion tons of carbon-agroforest natural gas. The global fossil natural gas production, which is of fossil origin, amounted to some 4 trillion cubic meters in 2023, or 300 million tons of natural gas. So in order to set off global fossil natural gas production, less than 2% of the capacity of only the 1 billion hectares of carbon-agroforest is needed and sufficient. So the production of 1 billion hectares will, on top of the additional food or on top of the 400% of all the food 8 billion humans consume today, produce a further 100% of the actual global production of natural gas, by only using 20% of its capacity. Natural gas burning without emissions and without toxins. As said, any actually produced and consumed gas prevenient, like for example from Yemen, is in fact fossil gas, and when burned or used will obviously emit carbon dioxide. None of the carbon-agroforest natural gas produced by the here proposed or any other agroforests will cause an increase of emissions, because during the growth of the carbon-agroforest, months and or years before the burning and before the consequent emissions caused by the burning of the carbon-agroforest natural gas, the amount of carbon dioxide equal to or equivalent to the expected emission will have been already captured from the atmosphere. In other words, what will be emitted, were sequestered out of the atmosphere in before, and while this is no carbon dioxide removal, it surely is a temporarily carbon dioxide removal. In any case, the burning of natural gas from carbon-agroforest is not an emitter. Furthermore, contrary to traditionally produced natural gas or what we call fossil natural gas, carbon-agroforest natural gas does not contain toxins. This, while so-called natural gas from fossil origin contains toxins, simply because it contains toxins from the mineral layers it was extracted from. Only 10% of only the carbon-agroforests used for superior gasoline production. Syngas to gasoline plus, STG plus, is a thermochemical process to convert natural gas, other gaseous hydrocarbons or gasified biomass into drop-in fuels, such as gasoline, diesel fuel or jet fuel, and organic solvents. This process is about 60% efficient, with a 40% loss of energy. 50 tons of wood or biomass per year and per hectare will result in 18 tons of syngas or over 16.2 tons of carbon-agroforest natural gas. For 1 billion hectares of carbon-agroforest, this results in 18 billion tons of syngas, or approximately 18 billion barrels of gasoline. Global gasoline demand was approximately 27 million barrels per day in 2023, and will stabilize at 29.6 million barrels per day, or 10.8 billion barrels per year through 2050. In other words, only 60% of the 1 billion hectares of carbon-agroforest needs to be dedicated to the production of gasoline, when this is in order to offset all fossil gasoline and its emissions. Still, 80% of the carbon-agroforest capacity remains available. We would like to remind you that up to this moment we have given a destination to only 20% of the production capacity of the proposed carbon-agroforest area of 1 billion hectares. Obviously, this tremendous potential could form and be seen as a clear challenge for several industries and companies, including several international industries and companies. In fact, and just for instance, the bicarbon agroforests produce superior and 100% or even over 100% renewable gasoline plus or STG plus, as well as other superior and also renewable fuels could very well challenge the ongoing transition to electrical cars, hybrid cars, as well as the whole of the so-called clean energy transition. The also produced renewable gasoline plus or STG plus could make the use of internal combustion cars and motors competitive or even advantageous, as well as also less emittent, zero emittent, or even a first-time carbon dioxide removing. This with carbon dioxide removal being impossible. This so in the case of electrical vehicles, this even so in the cases that 100% of the used electricity had been from renewable sources like solar and wind, with the only exception if the electricity had been generated by carbon agroforests. Apart from this, the use of gasoline plus from carbon agroforests could make internal combustion vehicles and motors the safest option. This latter could matter in all cases of parking, tunnel use. People with internal combustion vehicles and motors would be released from the urge and pressure to make the transition to electrical vehicles right away or as soon as possible. New, better, cleaner, and in addition also unedited carbon dioxide removal opportunities for tech leaders. On the other hand, the leaders of the above-mentioned industries and/or companies and/or even governments could very well envision that involvement in the massive new market of carbon agroforest robots, drones and systems could be much more lucrative or be more lucrative in a much shorter period of time, compared to any other economic activity. After all, it is about the basics of everything humans need, with quite some of the mining and/or production of these basics being fundamentally challenged. We are quite convinced that the dedicated robot, drone, and system market for the management and harvesting of these carbon agroforests is much bigger and business-like much more secure than that of electrical vehicles or any other type of vehicles. We insist to remind that carbon agroforest can produce masses of all basic materials that we 8 billion humans need and demand, obviously in a sustained and toxic-free way, and apart from healthy and organic foods, that includes the most modern or the most actual of basic materials, like for instance amongst many or in fact all others, graphite, carbon fiber, superior and toxic-free gasoline, hydrogen, electricity in all its forms, as well as possibly surprisingly rare earth elements and other materials in high demand. In other videos we will calculate how much more of this carbon agroforest capacity would be needed for all of the remaining carbohydrates, other than gasoline, to be set off. If you liked what you heard or saw in this video, help us to make a difference by subscribing to this channel, or leave a comment or a like on this video.